Hello and welcome to this ET panel of CEOs from Davos. We are joined by a very eminent panel of CEOs, Rajiv Memani, the chairperson of EY in the India region, Sumant Sinha, founder of Renew Power, Shobna Kamineni, chairperson of Apollo Hospitals, and Nigel Vaz, CEO of Publicis Sapient. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start with asking all of you to tell us your top impressions and takeaways from Davos this year. Rajiv, why don't we start with you?
I would say, everyone said that I think Trump almost sort of overshadowed his various comments that he made. I think that overshadowed the conversation in Davos. So that I won't say overshadowed, but that was the main conversation in Davos. But I think more importantly, what I saw is that the pivot towards growth across, especially the US companies, but across Middle East, US, other places, is much more visible this time than it was ever before. So the mindset is that of trying to see how can we grow more, how can we grow faster, and also using technology as a very important lever. I think AI has been there, and every new version of AI every time you come. This time it's agentic AI, but actually trying to see how that is resulting in growth, not just cost improvement and other things. So I would say that probably was if you have to look at the number one takeaway, I think that probably is the number one.
Lovely. Sumant?
Yeah, I agree with Rajiv. I think a lot of the conversation was around obviously Trump coming in, the daily news coming in from across the Atlantic on what executive orders he was passing, and therefore the consequential impact on geopolitics, particularly here in Europe, since we are right now in Europe. And frankly, there's a lot of consternation, is the sense I picked up, especially here in Europe, around what the consequences of a changed world order might be for the future. I think India is relatively well protected and insulated from a lot of the changes that might be happening. So I think in that sense, we are quite well off. But to come back to the theme of Davos this year, of course, AI is still a big issue, still part of many conversations. And for me particularly, obviously, I'm part of the climate change conversations, and a lot of the discussion was around how does one keep the climate change momentum going in the face of the fact that the largest economy in the world is just pulled themselves out yet again from all of this. Yeah. So how do we, the rest of us, how do we sort of motivate ourselves, and how do we keep going collectively?
And would you say, just to stay on that for a moment, would you say US withdrawal from the Paris Accord commitments are a big blow to the world's journey towards renewables and sustainability?
I think for sure that is the case because, the US accounts for a quarter of the world's economy. It's the largest cumulative carbon emitter in the world. And, we need their push to deal with climate change. Climate change requires multilateral action. And if the biggest, economy in the world suddenly pulls out their might and their effort, then obviously the momentum for the rest of the folks gets a little bit weaker. But having said that, I think that, there is still a lot of momentum that is built up. And I think as a result of that, there should continue to be, I think, enough of a push. And I think also within the US, we all know that, we've gone through 4 years of a Trump presidency already in the past. So we know how to work around it, with the states in the US and so on. So I think there are workarounds, but certainly it's going to take a step back. And especially now with Trump pushing fossil fuels and dialing back a little bit on clean energy, all of that changes the dynamic.
Thank you.
I agree with what Rajiv said mostly, but to put it, the main Congress hall that is the largest hall, free for all, the conversations over there really make me thankful that I'm in a country that knows how to navigate the crazies of the situation which could happen over the next couple of years, and also a different thought process, which is a different part of the world and their concerns. So India sitting in this strategic place with a strong leadership, I think, has the capability and can use this as an opportunity. So I come here to see what is the opportunity that I can bring back to India. And I think that I was pleasantly surprised that two of the things, one is, of course, AI, and India's we are out there. Some of the solutions we have I think many of the other, my peers in the world are doing the same. And actually, they're finding India is a great source to come and set up shop, like the GCCs. So most of the people that I'd met said that, oh, wow, 20% of our workforce is in India. So I think that's a huge takeaway. So AI leveraged on capabilities that can come from India is something that I really saw. And I like the fact that India and the States continued to put their best foot forward, signed a lot of good collaborations, because this is a place where so many CEOs will come, and in one day you get to see them. So I think it's important that India was represented nicely there. And since I've been coming here for 8 years, I continue to be optimistic that there's a place for everyone in this world.
And in the 8 years you've been coming, would you say this time, as you expressed, the anxieties that you picked up in the Congress Center, etc., are more heightened than ever before?
You can say that, but I think that there's always
some concern.
Yeah, there's always conflict out there. Here now, it's obvious that there's something, and things have been let out of the box. So you don't, they're. I just heard the Argentine Prime Minister and President. He doesn't hold back, because this whole thing of wokeness doesn't exist. I mean, he used that word woke and how horrible it is at least 10 times.
Yeah, between him and Trump, they've managed to turn it into a bad word.
Yeah, they did. But I think they're not alone, that they're out there. And but I think we should think about what India has to offer. And this is a time that we can offer this great stability, because we need to. If you look at it, I'm, really... I think the opportunity is that by 2030, we are going to have 1 billion people in the workforce. So we need to make connections, not just for India, but India becomes a huge market for all of the world. So I can understand why they're excited about us. But we need to also step out.
Right. Nigel?
I think a lot's been said, but I feel like over the years of coming to Davos, I think a couple things that are always true consistently over the years. The first is business hates uncertainty. And I feel like if I think about last year's Davos and this year's Davos, there's a lot more certainty now. And I feel like if you're a CEO leading any kind of company, the worst thing for you is uncertainty. And I feel like whether you like it or not now, there's more certainty about the economy, about the fact that a lot of countries are making the push towards growth. And so there's a more optimistic outlook on that front. I do think there are sectors and industries where there could be huge impacts depending on how the macroeconomic and geopolitical conversations go on a global basis, particularly in terms of food, in terms of automotive. There are sectors which I think, are in a wait and see in terms of how this plays out. Generally speaking, though, I feel like this Davos was far more optimistic economically, if quieter. I think there's been a lot of the limelight, stolen by so much of what's been going on in the United States with the inauguration, but also with, there's a marked sense of optimism about the economy there, and I think Europe in particular needs to find that same kind of optimism. And I think there was a lot of conversation about how that can happen. And I think, like was said, the rest of the world, I think, is also generally feeling more positive. At the same time, I think, with all the commentary about how things have gone over the years, I think, there have been many presidents, Brazil and others who've created consternation, or when the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, there was a lot of discussion about that. And I think every Davos has those political moments that play a meaningful role. The first Trump victory, I remember, and every one of those moments in Davos creates that hallmark of conversation. I think this time it was clearly, what is the impact of all of the executive orders, and how's that going to play out? I think thinking about it from an India perspective, our business is global. We have lots of folks in India and around the world. I think India is extraordinarily well positioned. I think India's position in Davos, but just generally in the conversation here, has only gone from strength to strength. Every year, it seems to be more prominent in terms of the physical manifestation of India on the promenade. I mean, I think every other storefront happens to be a state or a representation of India, which is
or an IT services company
for sure
based back home.
Yeah, which is pretty significant and is a marked change from maybe even a few years ago. So I think that's that's fantastic to see. And like I think other folks have said, I think the one overwhelming positive driver of both growth and the economy is technology. And I think the role that AI is going to play, both in terms of driving growth, in terms of acceleration from industries as diverse as healthcare to energy and retail and financial services, you're starting to see meaningful applications of that kind of work, and work that is being done like the work we're doing with our teams in India and on a global basis, which is now actually delivering real meaningful value, real transformative outcomes in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. I think AI has moved out of the proof of concept stage, and I think you're starting to see a lot of executives realize that this is the opportunity to reimagine their business in the context of this new way of working. I feel like this is probably as similar as when we first started to see the advent of the internet. And there's a lot of conversations back then, I'm sure many of you remember, with the browser wars and what have you, right? But that was all infrastructure. The magic happened after that. And I feel like we're just poised to break out now.
Lovely. The theme of our discussion today is the roadmap to 2047. I want to come to each of you to talk about what are the 2 or 3 things that India needs to do in terms of reforms and incentives. While Indian states compete for investments here, let's also be clear that India as a destination also competes for investments with a number of other bullish, competitive countries, especially in manufacturing. What are the 2 or 3 things in terms of reforms or incentives you would recommend India should do for more consistent long-term growth? Rajiv?
Yeah, I won't say any specific reforms. I think a lot of reforms have been played out. I think the thing that India really needs to work on, and has been working on to their credit, but I think a lot of work needs to happen there, is on ease of doing business and just simplifying rules and laws so that you can unshackle the power of the market, you can unshackle the full spirit of entrepreneurship. I would say that is probably the number one thing that we need to do, and you can start with a number of laws, number of regulations. The government has been constantly evaluating, but how can we use technology more effectively to just make it more simpler for people to get on with business? GST was probably one of the best. If you have to look at the last 10 years, 11 years, and if you have to pick the top 3 reforms, GST would be one of them. But I think it's time now to see how it can be simplified further. Because when investors come, and since we are in Davos, I would say I would probably use a more lens of a foreign investor, but it's true for Indians also. When they have, suddenly they see 5 notices given, 6 notices given, 8 given, being in courts for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. I think that really creates a challenge. So I think if they can find a way that if I'm operating in 20 states, I don't have to get assessments or audits done in all 20 states. I can just do one state and the center, or just the center and others can follow. Whatever it is, whatever gives the confidence to all the stakeholders concerned. And so I would say laws like that. Also, in terms of litigation, can there be alternative forms of dispute resolution? Can there be greater enforcement of contracts? Can the time that's taken in courts for resolution of issues, can that be reduced? So I would say that probably, in my view, is the number one thing. I think India has done very well on technology, has done very well on IT services. GCC is the big new theme. The AI mission that the government is working on, I think is good. I think we need to just constantly ensure that what happened in the earlier time, when we lost some of the earlier battles and you had the global players pretty much dominate the space. In AI and other places, data is, India will have the greatest amount of data. And how do we create the AI platform so that it becomes easier for citizens, easier for businesses to use that data for doing businesses? Because that's a great source, enormous source of competitive advantage, and the government is as you know, is working on that. And if there are two silver bullets, I think in terms of what will contribute to this growth, one is manufacturing, and some of the things that I mentioned have been there, but we have to find ways in which we link to the global value chains. 70% of the business happens through the global value chains. So, to make our manufacturing more competitive, we need to ensure that we are linked to the global value chains, and we drive that further. That will give a great impetus to growth. And then energy transition is going to be the greatest. If I look at the per capita consumption of energy today, India is amongst the lowest. It's about 18 gigajoules or whatever. And if you look at 2047 and assume it's going to be, a 25, $26 trillion economy at that time, the total consumption of energy will be about 370 billion gigajoules. Now, India imports 40 to 50% of the energy needs, will go bankrupt. The world cannot afford that kind of energy. Therefore, how we grow the renewable energy and how do we use nature and our own resources for doing that, right? And through the supply chain, not just the development, but through the supply chain of that. I think that will be very critical. And I'm sure what reforms need to be done there, Sumant will be in the best position to talk about that. But that's a big opportunity.
And Rajiv, is your sense that there is a very wide degree of variance in ease of doing business among different Indian states?
There is a variance, for sure. I won't say there is wide. What happens is the rules are the rules. Question is how do they get implemented and how many people interpret it. So on paper you will say, okay, these are the rules that are there. But so how we can make it easier? If I have once deposited all my 15, my certificate of incorporation, this approval, boiler certificate approval, this approval, it can be, it's in a state locker depository. It can be used automatically for giving 60. Now, some state governments are already in that process and they're already doing that.
Right.
So I think rules probably may not vary that much, but how they're implemented, executed, and interpreted, I think that varies significantly from state to state.
So, Sumant, I would love to hear from you, as Rajiv said, about what needs to change in clean energy to secure India's energy future, but also the broader point about what else needs to change in the overall business landscape.
Yeah, so I think Rajiv obviously gave a pretty broad view on what needs to be done, and all of those are absolutely valid. I think that judicial reform is an important aspect. Enforcement of contracts is still very delayed. We are in the courts on various change in law, contracts, and so on. Those take forever to clear up, right? And it is the system that we have right now. So how can we look at reforming some of those areas? I think the second thing that is also very important is how do we continue to build the infrastructure of the country? We've done a pretty good job so far in the last few years, but obviously India is a massively growing country, and we are still at the beginning of that process. I think over the next 22, 23 years towards Viksit Bharat in 2047, and if as the Prime Minister's target is to make India a developed country, we need to continue to work on infrastructure very significantly over the next 22 years. And that hopefully then brings down the logistics cost, which is so high in India, and is actually therefore becoming a drag for manufacturing. So there are all sorts of attendant benefits that then begin to emerge from some of these continued reforms. And frankly, I think what's happened is that because India has been on a certain trajectory over the last 10 years, when you come to places like Davos, we were talking about why the impact of India is going up. It's going up because India's economic heft is increasing. We are now the 5th largest economy in the world, but we all know that in 2 or 3 years from now, we'll become the 3rd largest economy in the world. 20% of future growth of the world is going to come from India, right? So as all of that happens, people will start going to India for accessing that growth. And I think if we can do some of these things to make the ease of operation easier and bring down the cost of operation as well, that is then going to lead to a win-win for obviously India and Indians on the one hand, as well as foreign investors on the other hand, and domestic investors as well. The other thing I think that is also required is we need to invest in education. We need to get more employable people out there. We need to get more trained engineers on things like AI if we have to take advantage of it, right? So I think that's another big area that we can potentially focus on. And to come to the point of clean energy specifically, India's energy demand is likely to grow at about 4 to 5% a year. Energy demand, which is the umbrella for electricity. Electricity is only a quarter of energy in totality. Now, as that happens, we will also see a shift towards electricity within energy. And within electricity, you'll see a massive shift towards renewables. When you do the math on all of these numbers, we require almost 3,000 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2047, which means that the target that we have currently of getting to 500 gigawatts by 2030, that target has to be replicated every 3 to 4 years after that for the next 15 or 20 years. And that will require an investment of $3 to $4 trillion over the next 20 years. These are very significant numbers. And we don't have a choice. We have to meet these targets because the country requires more economic growth. We require more power for that. And as Rajiv said, on a per capita basis, our consumption levels are still extremely low. So as we go to the developed country status, or even at the fringes of that, we'll need a lot more energy. So I think it's those kinds of massive investment opportunities in almost any sector that you look at. I'm sure in healthcare as well. Shobna will tell us that our penetration levels of healthcare have to increase so much, and that itself is so. I think almost every sector, and that's really why India is such a great opportunity for entrepreneurs, for investors, and will be for the next 20 odd years. So I think if the government can just get a few of these things, that they just can continue to work on them on a cumulative basis, we would have made so much more progress over the next 15 to 20 years. That will be a whole different country. And then in places like Davos, we'll be the talk of the town even more than we are right now.
So you said that 3,000 gigawatts is what we need by 2047. What is the installed capacity today?
Today, the installed capacity of renewable energy in India is about 200 gigawatts. So we're talking about a 15 times growth rate. And just to put that in context, today the installed capacity in the US of all power generation sources is only 1,000 gigawatts. Okay, and in the US right now, there's so much excitement because of data centers creating demand, and nuclear company valuations have gone through the roof because that's the only way to meet that demand. India is going to have much more demand coming up over the next couple of decades. Yeah. Data centers are only going to be one facet of that demand growth. So it'll be a whole different equation over the next many years.
Lovely. Thank you, Sumant. Ma'am, we'll come to you, and if you could tackle in the same way the broader themes, but also specific to healthcare.
But let me start with the preface, because both of them have expounded just perfectly on what needs to be done. So I don't have...
we believe in having very articulate people on our
No, but I think that the preface, just think about it, the Indian movie industry, how big is it? It's like $3 billion. That's the size of our, a lot of our companies with this. But think of their global influence. Yeah. It's just hundreds of billions. So think about that. Think about the fact that we have that 2 million Indians, just like you, 2 million Indians outside India actually run the healthcare and the IT, of almost globally, but of those countries. And so think of, what we have within India, that the metric is very different now, what we should think of. What is our global influence? And I think that global influence by 2047 is going to be far larger, because the India story by India will start kicking in. So it's not about having a $2,800 per cap, which is really quite among the lowest. But what will happen is that as this goes, then, and let me tell you what it needs to grow at to be that we have to become a developed country before we become an old and poor country. So this is the challenge, that midpoint, because we have huge global influence. We will become the third largest economy, but there are going to be a lot of people that you have to distribute this money to. They're going to be, in 2030, there are going to be 1 billion people ready for work in India. Which country ever is going to be that?
It's an advantage and a source of possibility.
So that's what we need to do. So that's where we're coming from. That if you look at the textile industry, look at manufacturing for global networks, what we've done with phones. So more and more companies, whether it's automotive, whether it's defense, we have to become part of global supply chains. They've spoken about how to bring the cost down. Otherwise, if you're not competitive, it's a pipe dream. So become competitive in that, create these jobs, extreme number of jobs. And when that happens, people, when they start seeing consumption happening in the country, with this of billions of people consuming every single. That's the influence. We don't have to go to Davos. Davos will come to us with this. That's the kind of the flow back that India has, which means that we need to be able to create jobs. So again, double down on education, but it's not education for education's sake. We have to start thinking, how do we make smarter Indians? Because it's, right from that 1,000 days of nutrition, if you don't make them smart, that whole big population of people. So think about that. So go back one step, think about education, figure out, the government is doing great, apprentice, many things, but each one of us has a responsibility to do that. Then think about the fact that India is no longer about 6 metros. The consumption will happen in 100, 150 new cities. So it's not just about the states. So it's going to be huge and diverse. So all this is going to bring to bear that we are going to develop a country for this. So have we set up? I think that I wouldn't judge government by, this thing one term, because again, as owners, when we build businesses, we don't do it for quarter to quarter. We look at the medium term, we look at the long term.
And what better example in some ways as the work your father, for instance, did in building Apollo.
And we've grown 20% compounded for 20 years. But my kids will get it too. They'll be in an India that has it. So if we can create that story, 8% growth is so possible. Coming to healthcare, I think that India has a great opportunity to be in global networks. One is that people will start thinking about setting up manufacturing. But what they said is we need more ecosystems, because not just for Indian consumption, but for export. So there's a huge opportunity in manufacturing consumables, pharmaceuticals already. If India stops producing medicine, the world will have a headache.
Vaccines
with this. No, just basic pharmaceuticals are all 60% of all generics come from India.
Yeah.
So this whole thing, and now innovation will come. So the next thing, when semaglutide goes out of patent next year, there are 5 Indian companies already that are applying.
Yes.
So all these are going to spike.
We're all going to be very thin. I don't mean
hopefully.
I don't mean us, but Indians in general.
Me first.
Yeah.
No, but having said that, I think that we have solid opportunities, foundations that have been this thing, and my conversation is only a build on, an add on to what Sumant and Rajiv have said. But again, in healthcare, it's not going to be just about physical facilities. And this is something that we have to realize. It'll be about agentic, that we can keep people healthy, give them nudges. Now we can start looking at heart attacks. Microsoft is using our technology 1 week before a person has a heart attack. So I think these are the
He will die of anxiety,
He'll come into the hospital and get the stent. So to know that, you're in that, and to think about the way cancer will be dealt. So it's just like AI. Do not think that we can, that it is, that it will be a multiplier. It will be a far more exponential, that we don't even know how. Like if you look at AlphaFold yesterday, when I was looking at that, this will be science, and it's not like it won't be available for India, and there'll be Indians at the cutting edge of that, which makes me so happy in healthcare, that we know how to lead better lives, healthier lives.
Thank you. Sumant, I'll quietly let you go, and then I'll ask the last question. You really have to run, right? But if you can wait for Nigel's answer, then we are closed with that.
Yeah, we'll wait.
I'll try and be brief to facilitate. I mean, when you go last, there's very little you can say after.
I agree.
Last question to you, Nigel, but I want to harness your expertise quite specifically, which is there is a lot of concern in India and in much of the developing world that the playing field in AI, because the hardware is critical, because resources, access to resources is really critical. Foundational models and GPUs are overwhelmingly present in a few countries. So the global playing field in such a critical technology that's going to change everyone's lives, will it be far too skewed to our disadvantage? I mean, of India and much of the developing world.
Well, it's interesting because I go back to what I was talking about earlier. You have to look at where we are in the continuum. So if you think about the early days of the internet, right, there was a lot of obsession about browsers, and there was a lot of obsession about internet infrastructure. But the real value starts to come in once that infrastructure starts to get deployed more broadly, and people can actually start to leverage that infrastructure to actually innovate. And what you saw there is you saw the democratization of the internet touch banking and retail and financial services and every other area. And when I think about AI right now, I feel like there's two ways you can think about AI. You can think about AI in the context of where we are now, and you can think about AI in the context of where we need to go. And I think if you think about AI in the context of where we are now, we are very much in the infrastructure phase of AI. We're talking about foundation models, we're talking about data centers. All of these things are going to be hugely critical, and every new model starts to create value. But as we work with companies across the world and in India, leveraging AI, what you start to realize is the applications that you build. So the work that we're doing in healthcare with oncologists and radiologists to diagnose tumors more accurately in the context of whether they're benign or whether you need to be referred to a biopsy, or whether you think about advancing, drug discovery or banking the unbanked. A lot of that is where India has some massive inherent advantages, because first and foremost, I think AI, as you're starting to see with the Stargate announcement, the United States, from yesterday or the day before, what you saw in many countries, they're starting to establish the public-private partnership ecosystem, right? And that public-private partnership in India has already stolen a march because of national identity, because of centralized payments infrastructure, because of the number of people being brought into the digital ecosystem and exhaust of data that is significant. So I think now the next step has to be, how do you actually take what is a tremendously technologically literate workforce and move them out of what historically used to be a cost arbitrage based, lower cost Indian IT services industry that kind of built itself up that way into this far more innovation driven, far more value creation driven, both for within the country and for outside. Because I think what you'll start to see is when you have a strong public-private partnership, when you have a tech literate workforce, when you have a significant amount of data across industries, you will start to see the value creation on top of these AI infrastructure platforms that will essentially act like power. It's almost like, when we were talking about energy, right? Once you actually have the fundamentals of power, then the factories and everything get built on top of them. It's the same with the internet. You had the browsers and you basically had the infrastructure, and then you started to see the Swiggy and the Zomato and the Uber Eats built on top of that. I feel like we're barely scratching the surface of that AI journey in the context of education, in the context of healthcare, in the context of banking, retail, travel, and hospitality. And I feel like we just haven't embraced the potential of what this is going to look like, because to the points that were made earlier, right? This is about the reimagination of how you educate people. It's not about, simply teaching people the way they've been taught before, because everything they learn is going to be irrelevant in a matter of 3 or 4 years. And so you're going to have to constantly learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I think this is where India's young workforce, with a huge focus on literacy and education, could make a massive difference in a world that is increasingly going to compete for talent in this AI space.
Thank you all for your time and for these
You're
wonderfully
so cool.
insightful comments. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.